In this video, you are going to master the Nimzo-Indian Defense with the black pieces. So let's start. So we are playing with the black pieces and white starts the game with 1d4. We play the move knight f6, c4, e6, and on the third move, white plays the move knight to c3. And from here the Nimzo-Indian begin. After knight to c3, black is usually having two ways to continue the position. We can play d5, the queen's gambit decline, or we can play the move bishop to b4, the Nimzo-Indian defense. We are going to focus on the move bishop to b4, which is also known as the Nimzo-Indian, and it is definitely a much more flexible move because after playing d5 we are committing the pawn, whereas after bishop b4 we are keeping flexibility with the pawn on d7. After bishop to b4 there are already tons of theory, there are tons of moves for white to continue the position. Today I have taken a particular topic which is e3. After e3 we are going to short castle, and particularly we are going to focus on the move bishop to d2. This particular variation is getting popular day by day, so I'm thinking to cover this particular line in today's video. So after bishop d2, we are going to play the move d5, already challenging the center. After d5, white is having 4 critical moves to continue the position. White can play the move knight to f3, a3, rook to c1, or white can play the move bishop to d3. These 4 moves are the most critical. Let's first start with what happens if your opponent plays the move bishop to d3. Simply developing the bishop. After developing the bishop, we can already capture on c4 because it already gives us a tempo. Bishop takes, and here we can already play the move c5. The idea is pretty clear, we are already targeting the center. White plays e3 targeting the bishop, or else we are happy to capture on d4. So here we capture the knight, bishop take, and we can play the move knight to e4 in this position. The idea is pretty clear, we want to take the bishop from the c3 and the position would be pretty much even. We can play the move b6, bishop b7. A very important thing to notice, we are not taking on d4 first because after queen into d4, the bishop can be moved and we aren't so flexible to capture the bishop. So that's the reason we first play knight e4 and the position is even. So going back, bishop d3 is not the best. Now let's try to focus on what happens if rook c1. After rook c1, now the main flaw in this position here is white is focusing on developing all his pieces on the queen side, but if you see clearly, there is not a single piece have been developed from the king side. So it's a good opportunity for us to open the center. After c5, white plays a3, takes, bishop takes, and we can play the move c into d4. We are trying to open up the center, try to target the king. c d4, bishop d4. The idea is pretty clear because if you try to capture with the e pawn, the bishop is simply bad on c3. And we can even consider after e d4 to capture the pawn on c4 as well. So that's the reason bishop d4, and we can play the move knight c6. The idea is to simply capture the bishop. The bishop moves back and we can play the move queen e7, and after queen e7 the position is already even, I would say, but it is much easier to play with the black pieces. The idea is pretty much simple. We want to play the move rook d8 and target the queen. And after queen to e7, for example, if white continues with knight to f3, we can already play the move rook to d8. The idea is to simply capture the c4 pawn, attacking the queen. So after a move like queen to c2, we can play the move e5 in this position. The idea is pretty simple. Our threat is to play the move d4. So white is forced to capture the pawn on d5. After knight d5, black is already having a very comfortable position. We can capture the bishop. We can develop our bishop to f5, bishop to e6, and black is having a very comfortable position. So that's the reason, going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays rook to c1 in this position. So going back, what happens if your opponent plays the move a3 in the position? The idea is to simply hit the bishop. We pull the bishop back because if you try to capture the knight in this position, white will capture the bishop with the bishop. So after bishop e7, we have knight f3. And we can play the move b6. So this is generally the main idea in such position, to develop the bishop to b7 and strike with c4. After b6, we have c d5, e d5, and here we have the move b4 in this position. The idea makes sense. White's idea is to stop black c5, but we are not scared. We can still play the move c5, and after b takes, d takes, we can simply capture on c5. And the main problem for white in this position here is the bishop is on d2. And our idea is pretty simple. We are going to play the move knight c6, d4. And once that d4 comes on the board, the position is dead equal, and white can't achieve anything in this position. So white actually can't stop this d4 idea. So that's the reason. Once we establish after knight c6, d4, the position is dead equal. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e3. Now coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays knight to f3 in this position? After knight f3, from the here, the main theory begins. After knight f3, we are going to first play the move b6. The idea is pretty clear. We want to play bishop b7, bishop d6, and followed by c5. So after b6, white is already having three main moves to continue the position. White can play bishop d3, a3, or siege d5. If white plays bishop to d3, simply developing the bishop, it just allows us to give a tempo by simply capturing on c4, takes, and bishop to b7, developing the bishop. White castle, and we can play the move knight to d7. The idea is pretty simple. We are developing the piece, and now after knight d7, queen e2, we are simply striking with c5. And after c5, let's take e3, takes, and simply play the move knight e4. The idea is pretty simple. We want to eliminate the bishop. And once the bishop, if white wants to play bishop e1, he can, but the rook on f1 would simply be dead. So after knight e4, we are going to capture the bishop in this position, and black would be having an even position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop to d3. If the opponent plays a3 in this position, we can play the move bishop to d6. The idea is pretty simple because the bishop on d6 covers the e5 square, and it's the most ideal square for the bishop. So b4, we can capture on c4 in this position because, or else white's idea is pretty simple to play the move c5 and get a good position. So we are forced to capture on c4, and here white is having two main moves. White can play the move e4 or capture the pawn on c4. If white tries to play e4, which looks pretty interesting, the idea is pretty simple. White wants to play e5, so we must move our bishop back to e7, which is the fourth move actually. Bishop into c4, and now we can already play the move c5, striking in the center. dc5, bc5, let's take g5. We can capture the pawn. Pawn takes, because if you can't capture with the knight because the pawn is hanging. If you try to capture with the bishop, I'm happy to capture the bishop. Black would be having a better position. So after pawn takes, which is the fourth move, we can already play the move knight to d7 in this position. And after knight d7, like white can't castle in this position because after knight b6, we can capture the pawn on d5. So white is forced to play bishop f4, protecting the pawn on d1 with the queen, or d5 with the queen. So after knight b6, the bishop falls back, and it's just one move. We can play the move bishop a6, covering the f1 square, not allowing white to castle, and this position is already better for black. Like for example, after d6, it looks like the bishop is trapped, but already knight a5, knight h5, hitting this bishop. So after takes, bishop e3, it looks like black is a complete piece down. Indeed we are, but after knight to f4, we can capture on g2, we can play the move knight to d3 check, rook to d8, and the engine already shows this position as -7. The position is already completely winning for black. So that's exactly how you can play this position if your opponent plays e4. So if white captures and goes with the main move, which is bishop c4, we can still play the move c5, striking in the center, takes, and if white plays d5, we can take the pawn, knight takes, knight to d7. Our idea is pretty simple. We want to put our knight to b6. For example, after short castle, knight b6, takes, bishop e2, bishop b7, and we can already sense how these two bishops are simply monstrous piece. Indeed, our c5 pawn is a bit weak, but after rook d8, rook c8, it is much easier to play with the black pieces, and we can even convert this liability into an asset by pushing this pawn and getting a good position. So that's why this is how you can play if your opponent plays e3. Now looking for the move, what happens if your opponent plays c into d5, which is the main move. After c d5, we capture with e d5, and here white is having already tons of options in this position. White can play the move bishop to d3, rook to c1, rook to c1, bishop to e2, or queen to c2. These four are the key options. If white continues with rook to c1, the idea is pretty simple. White wants to play knight to b5, attacking the c7 pawn. So first, we play the move bishop b7, focusing on developing the piece. And here, if white plays bishop d3, we can play the move bishop to e7. The idea is pretty simple. We can't put our bishop to d6 because it allows knight b5 to capture the bishop. So that's the reason we play bishop e7 first. And after bishop e7, if white short castle, we can simply play c5 now. And after a move like knight e5, we can play the move knight c6. And this is the usual idea. We first pull back the bishop, and then we push up onto c5. Knight c6, and after f4, we can take on d4 in this position, where after e d4, we can take back the d4 pawn, and we would be a pawn up. So white is forced to capture the knight, and after takes, queen d7, white can play the move f5 trying to get some play on the king side, but already b5 in this position. Very interesting. Our idea is to push the pawn to b4, attack this knight, and put our knight e4. And black would be having a very healthy position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight e5. If your opponent goes for capturing the pawn, we can take the pawn, rook e1, rook to e8, simply focusing on developing the piece. If e4, there's a very interesting line. We can take the pawn, bishop takes, and play the move knight to a6 in this position. And the position is around about even, I would say, because black is having the bishop pair, a strong bishop eyeing on the king side. Indeed, we are having the weak pawn, but it doesn't really matter. We can play queen b6, rook d8, and black is having a healthy position. It's an even position because we are having the bishop pair. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent short castle. If your opponent plays knight e5 in this position before short castling, we can already play knight c5, the main idea. Queen f3, and we can play the move knight to c6. Queen h3, the idea is to simply try to checkmate on the king side, but we can happily capture the knight and put a knight to e4. And after f4, it again look white's idea is to simply short castle, maybe get his rook into the game, try to put some attack on the king side, but we can already stop it with f5 move, very strong. And our knight is permanently fixed on e4, and we are pretty happy with this position. If your opponent shot and passing in this position, we can already take with the bishop, and we are having a strong bishop on f6 as well. That's why this position is already healthy for black. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop to d3. Going back, what happens if your opponent plays knight to b5, which looks strong. You are trying to hit this c7 pawn with the knight and the rook. So first we trade off the bishop, and now we play the move c5. Not a move like c6 to hit the knight back, but simply c5. The idea is pretty clear. Sometimes we are playing bishop d6 to provoke knight to b5, because once the knight is on b5, it is a useless piece. It is doing nothing, absolutely nothing on b5. So after c5, bishop e2, we can already play the move knight to e4. An important thing to note is after c5, after takes, white cannot capture the pawn because of knight e4, and white loses in exchange. That's the whole idea. White played the move bishop to e2. And after bishop e2, knight e4, attacking the queen, followed by c4. And our idea is pretty simple. We are going to play the move a6, b5, simply expanding on the queen side, and we are having a better position. So that's exactly what is the idea with rook to c1. Going back, what happens if your opponent plays queen to c2? After queen c2, the idea is pretty flexible. White is developing the queen to c2, but there's a main flaw in this position. White's idea generally in such types of position is to play bishop d3, knight e5, f4, short castle, queen f3, and the queen generally belongs to f3, followed by queen h3, rook f3, rook g3. It's the main idea to play on the king side. But as the queen is on c2 now, in this position, the queen can never go to f3, and that's the main flaw. After queen c2, we can play the move rook e8, bishop d3, followed by bishop f8. Because we cannot play bishop d6 in this position because of knight b5, and still we have to lose the bishop. Because of bishop f8, we lose the c7 pawn. That's the reason we are going to put the bishop at its second best square, which is f8. Bishop f8, short castle, and the idea is pretty simple. Again, the same idea, striking with the c5. After knight e5, we can play the move bishop b7, f4, knight to c6. Again, the idea is to capture the pawn. If knight e2 in this position, you must see the bishop is actually trapped on d3. We can play the move c4, hit the bishop on f5, and play the move knight e7, attacking the bishop. And once the bishop moves, we can play the move bishop c8. Because our bishop on b7 was doing nothing, so we try to trade off the bishop. And our idea is pretty simple. We put our knight e4, play the move f6, attacking the bishop, attacking the knight on e5, and we are already having a healthy position. So that's exactly how you can play if your opponent plays queen c2. If your opponent plays bishop to e2 in this position, developing the bishop to e2, we can play the move bishop to d6. First, pulling back the bishop, because now knight b5 is not really working, we can play the move bishop e7, and there is no rook c1 or queen c2, so our c7 pawn is no longer hanging. Now, our idea is to play the move c5, and the knight is already misplaced on b5. So that's the main idea. So bishop d6, knight b5 is a bad move. If knight e5, we can play the move c5 in this position, already striking in the center. Short castle, bishop b7. Rook c1, knight c6. Simply after c5, you can play the move bishop b7, knight c6, and that's how you must play the position. And after knight c6, the position is already even. If white tries to push the pawn, we can play cd4, where after takes, we can capture the d4 pawn. So white must capture the knight, takes, And we have already seen this position with b5, and black is having a healthy position. So that's exactly how you can play if your opponent plays bishop to e2. Now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent goes for the main move, which is the move bishop to d3, which contains the maximum theory. After bishop d3, we are going to play the move bishop to d6, first pulling back the bishop, which makes sense. And here, if white short castle, which makes sense, we are going to play the move rook e8. And here, if white plays rook to c1 in this position, the idea is pretty simple. White wants to play knight b5. We play the move c5 instantly. And after c5, if white captures the pawn, takes queen to a4. And after queen a4, white's idea here is white wants to put pressure on the center pawn. So the idea is to play the move knight b5. So we stop it with a6. And the main point of a6 is after knight b5, we definitely cannot capture the knight because the rook is hanging. But we can play the move bishop d7. And now the threat is to capture the knight, and black is already winning. That's the reason after a6, after rook d1, knight d7, black is having a healthy position because black is going to play the move bishop to b7, c4, knight to b6 or knight to c5, and black is having a healthy position. So that's what happens if your opponent plays dc5. If your opponent plays knight to e5, centralizing the knight, we can capture the knight and the pawn. We are a pawn up. And here, white's idea is to play the move e4. We can capture the pawn, takes, bishop f4. And the main point here is, if we put back the rook in this position, white can happily capture the pawn. Because after queen takes, rook takes, you cannot capture the bishop because it's a back rank issue. So after bishop f4, you can simply capture the bishop in this position, giving an exchange sacrifice. And after queen d5, attacking the bishop, our idea is to play bishop b7, c4, cementing this pawn, and we are having enough compensation for an exchange, and we are already having a much better position, despite being an exchange down. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays rook c1. If your opponent plays queen to c2 in this position, developing the queen, and the idea is still the same, to play the move knight to b5. So we play the move c5. Again, the same idea. After e4, the main idea for queen c2 is to open up the center. We can play the move c4, attacking the bishop, e5, because once the bishop moves, we can happily capture the pawn on e4 and be a pawn up. So white is forced to push the pawn. We can capture the bishop, queen takes, bishop to b4. But after takes, bishop a6, attacking the queen, knight b5 the fourth move. We can trade off the bishop, capture the pawn on f6, and we have an even position because the bishop is already good on a6. So that's how you can play if your opponent plays queen to c2. If your opponent plays rook to e1 in this position, which makes sense, which makes the maximum sense, you can play the move bishop to b7. Developing the bishop, queen c2. The idea is still knight b5, so we should play the move knight to a6 this time. Not playing the move c5. It's an only exception because after knight a6, our idea is to play knight to b4. So after a3, now we can play the move c5. After c5, e4, we can take the center, rook c8, attacking the queen, and black is having a healthy position. You can capture the knight on d5 if you want because it's a double attack. So if white tries to play something like queen b3, protecting this knight, we can already play knight c5, and you can already sense how black is having a better position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent does a short castle. If your opponent goes for rook to c1 first at the place of short castling, now we can play the move c5 because the idea is still knight to b5. After c5, we can play knight b5, bishop e7, short castle, bishop to b7, knight to e5, we can first play e6, kicking this knight, knight to c6, and after knight c6, it's an even position, you can already sense. And the main point here is we are kicking with a6 first because after knight c6, the main issue here, after knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, there is this knight d4, which is a bit irritating because we cannot capture the knight because the bishop is hanging. So that's the only reason we are first playing a6, kicking this knight, and then playing the move knight c6. That's the whole idea. So that's how you must play this Nimzo-Indian. So yeah guys, you have finally mastered the Nimzo-Indian e3 bishop to d2 variation. If you like this video, then make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel if you're new to our channel. I'm going to see you soon, so till then stay tuned and keep watching OneShot Chess.